Want to welcome everybody to this session. My name is Cynthia Celine, for those of you who are just joining. I'm with the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. And I'm also serving as the lead for the organizing committee of this here 4th International Conference on Anticipation. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I am delighted to present to you our keynote, Vanessa Andreotti, who is a professor and Canada Research Chair in Race, Inequalities, and Global Change, as part of the Department of Educational Studies at University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. Vanessa asks questions about how we can develop alternative ways to engage with alternatives. And so her work is well suited to the kinds of questions that we're asking at the Anticipation Conference. Her research examines historical and systemic patterns of reproduction of inequalities. Her most recent work, a book that came out in 2021, is called Hospicing Modernity, Facing Humanity's Wrongs and the Implications for Social Activism. And I can highly recommend this it really helps us to, not only rethink how we reckon with difference, with uncertainty, with complexity and failure as well, but it encourages us to both, unlearn some habits of thought, but also to really see anew and to build up some more courage, I think, to find new ways to make a difference. Today, we look forward to learn more about how her arts and research collective, Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures, works to identify and deactivate colonial habits of being and open up for new possibilities for collective existence and global change. She is joined by a collaborator. We'll be hearing some words from Chief Ninawa Inuhuni Kui, who is a hereditary chief and also elected president of the Federation of the Huniku People of Acre. He represents more than 16,000 people in 118 villages along 7 rivers of the Amazon basin. And so without further ado, I hand over the stage to Vanessa. Vanessa, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. I will start the presentation with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you from the unceded ancestral lands of the Stolo Indigenous peoples in what is known as Canada today. And as was mentioned before, it's extremely important that the land acknowledgements also emphasize our responsibility to support Indigenous people to have lands rematriated and their livelihoods restored. I'm also from a mixed heritage family with Guarani ancestry and German ancestry, and from the Guarani community where my mom is from. We also learn a different land acknowledgement where we acknowledge the land as a living entity, not a property or a resource. We acknowledge our responsibility towards the ancestors, who are both those who have come before and those yet to come. We acknowledge all the things that have made it possible for us to be here today, including all the violence that makes it possible for us to be having this conversation, including the violence in the communities in the global south, where the minerals for our screens and all the apparatus of the technological industrial complex are sourced. And we acknowledge also that we are a big family of human and non-human relations that is currently in dis-ease, and we have a responsibility towards that as well. This presentation was co-created with Chief Ninawa Hunikui, who couldn't be here today because he's in the communities and the internet there is not very good. And also because we're both going to COP27 tomorrow. And we had to prepare a lot for that. So what we did was to create a presentation together. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of the collective in the beginning, and then introduce the 3 points that he wanted to make in the beginning. And then we will finish going back to the 3 points. And what's in the middle are reflections related to the work of the collective that might help us sit with what he's asking us to do. So I'll start with just giving an overview of what the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures collective does. So we are a transdisciplinary collective of researchers, artists, educators, students, and Indigenous knowledge keepers. We work at the interface of questions related to historical, systemic, and ongoing violence on the one hand, and questions related to the unsustainability of our current habits of being on the other hand. We try to bring together concerns related to racism, colonialism, unsustainability, climate change, biodiversity laws, economic instability, global mental health crisis, and the intensifications of social and ecological violence, including the potential for social and ecological collapse. And because these issues are extremely heavy, we try to build containers, pedagogical and artistic containers, that can help us increase collective capacity and stamina for engagement with global challenges through decolonial systems/complexity literacies grounded on post-colonial, decolonial, Indigenous, and non-Western psychoanalytic practices. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. So I told you that Chief Didawa had 3 points to make. We're going to start with the 3 points today. So when I asked, what were the 3 things he wanted to say, he had many more, but I decided to him 3 is what we can sit with. And the first one was that a genuinely different future depends much less on the images we create in our heads than on our ability to repair and to weave different relations in the present. And this is super difficult work. The second thing was that what got us to the mess we are in are illusions of separation that damaged our relationships with our own selves, with each other, with other species, and with the land. And the third was that the modern colonial imagination cannot solve the problems that the modern colonial imagination has created. So as I said before, we're going to start with this and we're going to finish with this. And hopefully what's in the middle will help us sit with the invitation of Chief Ninawa to sit with the 3 points. So I had mentioned that we work with a non-Western form of psychoanalysis, and this is work with Indigenous communities, both here in Canada, but also, and most importantly, in Brazil. And these are communities that have a very different understanding of being. So the first lesson that we got in this partnership that is about 20 years old was a critique of modern education. So we were told that modern education focuses on the head, and it believes that by changing the head, our body will follow, or our bodies will follow. And their perspective, especially in the Hunikui community, is very different. What they were saying was that it's the gut that is most important. So you educate the gut so that it fills the heart, and the head will follow. It's the other process. So we started thinking about the importance of this education of the gut, the visceral education, because the gut, according to them, is the source of responsibility. And the visceral responsibility that I'm talking about is not an intellectual choice or a matter of convenience. It's something that we do even when it goes against our self-interest. And in this understanding of learning, of education, and of being, there's an inseparability of cognitive, affective, relational, and nested metabolic dimensions of being. The idea that you're not just your body, you're a cell in a wider metabolism that is the planet. we're trying to use the word psychoanalysis because it's the one that resonates the most when we talk about the unconscious in Western society. But in Western psychoanalysis, the source of conscience is the human. It's anthropocentric. So it's either the human body or human language. And in this form of psychoanalysis, the land, in its expanded understanding, is the source of consciousness. And this is engaged with through entheogenic encounters with older than human beings. And here I'm talking about what we would understand in the Western context as psychedelic sometimes, or we are talking about compounds coming from sacred plants like mescaline, psilocybin, and DMT. So in their critique of Western society, what we hear is that modernity coloniality is imposing a neurobiological or libidinal design grounded in the sense of separability. So our desires and imagination are preset to reproduce modernity coloniality. Therefore, examining modern and colonial inherited designs is a way to educate the gut towards reverence, respect, reciprocity, and responsibility towards the planet. And we're using the word adjacent possible differently. We're reinterpreting it from the ways that it's been used so far as something that is viable, but unimaginable or unintelligible within modern colonial conscious and unconscious designs and desires. So what we're trying to do is activate exiled capacities and deactivate harmful desires and perceived entitlements that are set up, are preset to reproduce modernity coloniality. And this is extremely difficult because colonialism is delicious. And if it wasn't, it would have ended a long time ago. This is what they say in Brazil. So part of this design that has been imposed on us are 4 socially sanctioned denials, and this becomes the anchor of our analysis today. The first is the denial of systemic violence and complicity in harm, the fact that our comforts, securities, and enjoyments are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation somewhere else. They happen at the expense of other people, species, and the land. The second is the denial of the limits of the planet, the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption indefinitely. The third is the denial of entanglement, our insistence in seeing ourselves as separate from each other and the land, rather than entangled within a living, wider metabolism that is biointelligent. And the fourth is the denial of the magnitude and complexity of the challenges we'll need to face together, the tendency to look for simplistic solutions that make us feel and look good and that may address symptoms, but not the root causes of our collective hyper-complex predicament. So the collective works mainly in the field of education and arts, with lots of branches going out to different fields, but it's important to understand how our socio-educational context today is very layered and very different from probably the context where we grew up. So the first thing that we have identified as an important layer is that there is in the educational context, there is a cacophony of perspectives. There's misinformation overload and the impossibility of stable authorities or imposed consensus. The second one is an oversaturation of unprocessed emotions, a lack of resilience and collective capacity to process complex emotions within and around us. There also is increase in volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity that is reflected in social fragmentation and polarized perspectives on the common good. There's also a sense of meta-consumption. And here we're not talking only about consumption of stuff, but consumption of relationships, of knowledge, of critique, of experiences, and consumption as a mode of relating to the world. So there are lots of incentives and rewards for self-centered, hyper-individualistic behavior and this meta-entitlement to curate reality. The fifth one is a self-infantilizing propensity, a proliferation of fragilities and entitlements, which is described by some of the elders we work with as the failure of the Western culture to produce grown-ups. And here we see hope as a prefiguration or projection or a teleology placed in the future rather than the relational possibility in the present for weaving relationships, as Chief Ninawa has gestured towards. And the sixth layer that we find important to emphasize is we're living in a context of intergenerational resentment, where the limits of the planet have been reached and the promise of endless prosperity is perceived as broken rather than unrealistic. And that has been described by young people in our collective as being like watching a train wreck in slow motion while you still want the Gucci bag and you know it's a scam, but you can't interrupt that desire. So in this context, there is a catch-22 of formal education. So there are common assumptions in formal education that really create a circular system. So for example, in my field with the discipline of education, we believe that talking about negative things makes people feel demotivated, that complexity causes people to feel overwhelmed, that exposing complicities makes people feel uncomfortable, that lack of simple solutions immobilizes people, that uncertainty makes people feel anxious, that talking about the possibility of wider social and ecological collapse in our lifetime can make people feel hopeless or angry. So we try to make it short, make it simple, make it easy, light, fun, and hopeful. And this in itself creates a specific kind of subjectivity that then is demotivated by negative things, is overwhelmed with complexity, feels uncomfortable with complicities, is immobilized by simple solutions, and so on. So then what we have when we talk about social and global change is a merry-go-round where people are really attached to safe and simplistic feel-good, look-good solutions that sustain the status quo, that when we talk about partnerships, generally we go into tokenistic transactional engagements driven by optics and consumption. And when we talk about the imagination, we see a narrow and limited imagination of what is possible and what is desirable. And for us to be able to interrupt the merry-go-round, we need to sit and understand much better what modern colonial education has done to our reasoning and to our configuration of desires. And that's what I'm going to do in the next 2 slides. So in terms of the modern colonial grammar of reasoning, what we've mapped is this image of Boxhead. And Boxhead is an aesthetic critique rather than, it's also analytical, but I invite you to engage with Boxhead as an aesthetic being. So Boxhead is a huge square head in a very small body. And in the square head, you have several words that represent the tenets of this grammar of being. So the first one is that it is logocentric. It relates to the indexing, this logocentric word relates to the indexing of reality in language, which would be translated into I say, therefore it is. It's universalist. It relates to the search for an objective and universal description of reality. So I think, therefore it's all there is. Then it's anthropocentric. It relates to the perception of humanity as a mandate to own, manage, exploit, and control nature. I think, therefore I rule. It's teleological and utility maximizing. So it's a reasoning that establishes predefined goals for engineering the world and getting the greatest value for the energy spent. I plan, therefore it will be. It's also dialectical, which relates to a linear logic of progression of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis that is averse to paradoxes, complexities, and contradictions. It's this, therefore it cannot be that. And also allochronic and evolutionary, which relates to the judging of others according to a criteria where oneself is represented as being in the present and as the apex of linear time and evolution. So I succeed because I'm intelligent and strong, therefore you perish because you are unintelligible and weak. And in terms of the configuration of desires, we have also tried to map modern colonial archetypes. So we mapped archetypes of agency, benevolence, and exceptionalism. The archetypes of agency would be related to justice arbitration, which is the judge, the righteous, the expert, moral authority, the leader, the problem solver, the change maker, unreserved admiration, the person looking for the validation as the savior, the hero, the martyr, and duty affirmation, the guru, the chosen, the carer. And then there is an archetype of exceptionalism, of unrestricted autonomy, the innocent, the virtuous, the deserving. And generally this archetype wants to connect. There is this idea, there's this search for connection, but it is connection with the whales, the flowers, the moon, and the sun, but not with the shit. And the shit, and collective and individual shit to be composted is placed somewhere else, and we create a sanitized space where we don't deal with the shit. However, what Chief Ninawa was talking about in terms of the difficult work we have to do in the present is about composting that shit and turning it into new soil. However, if we are escaping from that shit into the future or into hope placed in the future, we are never going to be able to do that difficult work. So part of the work of our collective, starting from there, has been to attempt to expand our capacity to sit with difficult and painful things without feeling overwhelmed, immobilized, or demanding quick fixes or to be rescued from the discomfort. And we generally say, if there's no shit, there's no starter for the process of building different relations and building relationships differently. So our analysis is also that we are now in a context where we have the weight of layers of complexity and complexities really crushing our backs. So you have systemic, historical, intergenerational, and personal complexities carrying them on our back and trying to use the stick of unstable certainties to fend off the fear, frustration, resentment, hopelessness, disillusionment, immobilization, isolation, scarcity, and despair that we feel through the pressure on our back, but also in the winds of the climate catastrophe, the ecocides and possibility of human extinction, and the intensification of violence and inequalities. So we were looking for the kind of education that could do this movement, take this thing that is on our backs and hold them in front of us. So build the muscles of the hands and the legs so that we can have both the strength and stability and the stamina to be able to lower this collectively together and hold space for all of that at the center. And we came up with this idea of depth education, which we contrast with master education. So master education is related to the filling of cups or the conquering of a peak. It's very much dopamine based, the mastering of concepts, of skills, and it's very useful for certain things. So for example, if I'm trying to train engineers to build a plane, master education could be a very good option. However, if we're thinking about building relationships, that is not the best way to go. So we've come up with this term of depth education, which in contrast to the cup and the tea would be more about peeling the layers of an onion or diving deep in the freezing ocean to discover that we are water, we are the water we are diving in, and we are also the shit that we put in that water. And depth education wants or tries to develop certain dispositions, which we call decolonial system complexity literacies, which is about hacking that box head that I presented before. And here I have 6 of these dispositions that we have mapped to give you an idea. So the first one is diffractive assessment, which is a different relationship with reality. So it's the ability to layer oneself and layer reality in order to identify and articulate complexities and paradoxes. The second one is diachronic and analectic reasoning. Analectic is opposed to, not as opposed, but it's a response to dialectic, which requires a different relationship with time, teleology, and progress, which means connecting the dots in the bigger picture across time and non-dialectically. The third one is the psychoaffective stamina, just a minute, which requires a different relationship with purpose, purity, and relationality, which is about holding space for difficulties and discomfort without being overwhelmed, immobilized, and demanding quick fixes, as I mentioned before. Then we have ontosympathetic resonance, which is a different relationship with pain and desire, which is a tuning into the pain of others and in oneself to interrupt harmful desires and entitlements. Then there's polysemic awareness, which is a different relationship with language, which is about navigating the ambivalence of language and the cacophony of perspectives. So understanding that whatever it is that I'm saying right now is being understood very differently by anybody who is listening, because they are interpreting it through their frames of reference. But being able to navigate and work with that is different from just acknowledging it. Then there's the SMDR compass recalibration, which is a different relationship with responsibility, which entails moving towards decolonial forms of sobriety, maturity, discernment, and responsibility as we face shadows, compost shit, and get through storms together. So this can be summarized into what we call 5 steps back, which require this psychoanalytic distancing. The first step back is a step back from yourself, where you are able to notice what your real investments is, what your fears, what insecurities, hopes, and intentions are, and you're able to track where they come from. And you're asking questions like, what does my ego feel entitled and justified to do? How come? What unprocessed emotions or unexamined desires or traumas could be driving my decision-making? The second one is a step back from your immediate context and time. How do the challenges in your immediate context reflect wider social patterns of change in society across different timescales? What's your perspective of the larger picture? What are the boundaries of this perspective? How is it limited? The third is a step back from your generational cohort. How are the associated challenges perceived and experienced by other generations? What's your generation being called out on, and how do you receive that? Step back, the fourth is a step back from the universalization of your social, cultural, and economic parameters of normality. So what does your privilege prevent you from seeing and experiencing? What are you projecting as normal and desirable for everyone? And how does that reflect your own background? And the fifth is a step back from familiar patterns of relationship building and problem solving that you have been socialized into. Who are you accountable to? What possibilities for more responsible steps are already viable, but are currently unimaginable to you and those around you? So I'll give you just 2 examples in the next 5 minutes of 2 tools that we use to do that. There are many other tools, but I think you need to have an idea. So the first tool that we use for self-layering and psychoanalytic distancing is the bus, called the bus within us, and where you invite people to imagine a bus within them, and it doesn't have to be a bus. Actually, the image doesn't matter as long as it reflects plurality, but the bus works really well. So in the bus, there's a driver, there are many passengers, some passengers at the front that you know very well, passengers in the middle, passengers at the back that you don't know, and that may be trying to sabotage your bus. And what we ask people to do is to observe the dynamics on their bus. We don't ask people to be confessional about what's happening in there, but to be able to hold space for the complexity of voices within them, of voices and effects within them. So paying attention to what passengers are saying to each other, how they are feeling, what they are thinking, which can be very different things and very contradictory. So do they sound that like somebody you know? Do they want things to be black and white? Do they trust you? Are they speaking from trauma? And you're doing all that kind of internal work with your own complexity, in terms of expanding your capacity to hold your internal complexity, because without that, there's no capacity, there's no chance you're going to have the capacity to deal with the complexity around you. And what we generally say is that without this work on yourself, you become work for other people, and you take up a lot of the space with things that you could have worked with yourself. And we don't have much collective time together, and the collective time should not be used to process individual things, but for us to hold that space for the things and the challenges that we have to face together. So whenever we present something, we use this methodology to create an environment where people can say sometimes, You check your bus and your bus is going around a roundabout, and we ask about the weather outside the bus, the weather inside the bus. We ask if there's any passenger burning something, if there's a party on your bus. And it's very useful in terms of the neurophysiology of this, what parts of the brain are engaged in this activity. And it makes it safe for people to say in a meeting, there's a passenger on my bus that has a problem with this, but there are other passengers who are questioning that passenger as well. So you can bring complexity to the table without losing face as well. So this is one of the exercises. So I'll ask you to observe your bus when I show you the next one, which is the House of Modernity built. It's a story. It's very, I'll do it in a very succinct way. It can be done in different ways. But as I tell you the story, observe your bus. And then I will finish the presentation and we can have a little bit of a conversation. So this is a story of the house modernity built. And this story comes from the literature, but it was also workshopped with Indigenous communities that contributed to the design. So the house modernity built is a house that exceeds the limits of the planet. And I'm going to put it here as a full mode. So the house exceeds the limits of the planet. The foundation of the house is a foundation of separability, the separation, the sense of separation between humans and nature that doesn't really take account that we are also nature. And there are two carrying walls of this house. The first wall is the nation state, which you tend to think about as being about protecting people, but the history of the nation state and the creation of the nation state is related to the protection of property and capital. And then there's the universal reason carrying wall, which is the single story of progress, development, and civilization that creates an epistemicide that kills the other stories, possible stories. And then the roof of this house today is the roof of global capital, global capitalism, shareholder, speculative, algorithmic capitalism. The second frame of the house relates to the hidden costs of the house, the fact that the house has been created and is subsidized and maintained by violence. So inside the house, we have unsustainable growth and overconsumption. And then we have expropriation and waste disposal back into the planet, creating destitution, dispossession, and genocide, and ecocide as well. Then we have the third frame of the house, which is the floors, where we are playing with the global north and global south here, but we have the north of the north and the penthouse. Then we have the north of the south, are people who have access to the stairs of social mobility within the house. And we have the south of the north, who are people who are still protected by the house, but don't have access to or do not desire access to social mobility. And then in the planet, we have the south of the south, which are people looking for or trying to defend different forms of being, like the Hunipui people in the Amazon, who have been fighting to remain part of the forest or to be the forest, and have put their lives on the line to save the Amazonian biome, resisting all the government efforts for them to assimilate or to kill them. So here in this frame, we have represented the false promise of universal middle class for all. And then the last frame is related to the house cracking under the weight of the climate catastrophe, economic instability, cancellation of rights, precarity, populism. So there's structural damage, especially in the roof, causing water damage in the house, and socioeconomic, political, ecological, and mental health crisis. And in the planet, we see more violent conflict and mass and forced migration. So do we fix the house? We expand the house? Do we build another house? Do we live without a house? Do we find more planets? These are the questions that Boxhead generally has to sit with. And what we are proposing is that Boxhead is not the best design to be able to deal with these issues. So what we're trying to do and inviting people to do is, and we do that through the metaphor walking a tightrope together with honesty, humility, humor, and hyper self-reflexivity, carrying a rod of intellectual and relational rigor, so that we do not fall into two types of abyss. The first abyss is the abyss of desperate hope, which we call, which associate with solutionism, and solutionism is trying to desperately grasp to the right ideology, a heroic authority, the chosen people, a special practice, or a return to a place and time. Or on the other hand, reckless hopelessness, which is doomism, which is associated with whateverism, hedonism, misanthropy, nihilism, and the banalization of brutality. So the invitation is to look for us to learn to walk the tightrope together. So we're back to what Chief Ninawa was saying, that a genuinely different future depends much less on the images we create in our heads than our ability to repair and to weave different relationships in the present, that what got us to the mess we are in are illusions of separation that damaged our relationships with our own selves, with each other and with other species and with the land, and the modern colonial imagination cannot solve the problems that the modern colonial imagination has created. So I hope that what was presented today helped give substance and support to Chief Ninawa's 3 points or 3 takeaways. I thank you for listening to me today. And here's the book that was mentioned in the introduction, Hospice in Modernity, where some of these ideas are also articulated. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanessa. That was such a wonderful presentation. So grateful for your work and for the work of Chief, I'm trying to show
Ninawa.
Ninawa, yes. I'm more laughing at my technical problems here. Always. always. And also of the collective, of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures group, and some of the different conceptual apparatus and metaphors that you've developed to help us to think about these things. Our time is short as we have sessions starting at the top of the hour, but I would like to give everyone who's with us an opportunity to add to the chat if you'd like to, or think within yourself about what has really resonated with you, about what you have heard here today. You can put questions in the chat as well. We don't have enough time to get into them, but I think it's always productive to see what's on your mind and to share those with others. You might want to reflect as well on what you're going to be continuing to think about and what you want to continue to explore in light of what Vanessa and the Chief have shared with us. Thank you so much, Vanessa. We're so grateful for the time you've spent. We wish you the best of luck over the next period and your experience with COP. And just thank you so much for the work that you're doing. We're very grateful. So thank you very much.